Good morning, I'm Matt Galloway, and you're listening to The Current. As you can imagine, there are people who are investing a lot of hope in this coronavirus vaccine research. Seth Berkley is an epidemiologist, a doctor, and a global vaccines expert. He's also the CEO of GAVI, the Vaccine Alliance. It's a global organization that helps get vaccines to developing countries. Seth Berkley, good morning to you.
Morning to you.
We heard just moments ago about the efforts here in Canada. If you step back and look globally at this, where are we at in terms of the development of a vaccine for COVID-19?
Well, first of all, it is a very exciting time on the scientific front. We're seeing unprecedented efforts around the world, and obviously speed is critical. So we've seen, for example, some novel techniques like the messenger RNA vaccine go from a genome sequence of the virus into a vaccine, which is in a vial in 42 days, and that clinical trial has already started. Now, of course, the exciting new technologies allow things like that to happen that quickly, but we also have to pay attention to make sure traditional vaccinology is also moving forward, because longer term, we're going to have to worry about how do we produce this product at scale. How do we technology transfer to many manufacturers if we need large quantities? And, of course, we want to make sure we understand the safety of the vaccine and how it would work in different groups. So these are all some of the challenges that are in front of us. But I am excited by the way science is attacking this.
How much collaboration is there between different countries and different organizations in trying to create a vaccine for this pandemic?
Well, I think what's interesting about that there are some global efforts. For example, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, has now funded 7 different vaccines to move forward, and those are in different locations, different technologies. So, that's a great effort to try to have a portfolio of vaccines. But what we know is that there's vaccine efforts going on around the world in places like China, in South Korea, in Germany, UK, many, many different countries. And I think what's important is that we don't end up with these being seen as national efforts, because we're going to need to be not only sharing information as we tend to do in science, but also we may need special techniques. For example, we want a vaccine that works well in the elderly. It is hard to get an immune response in the elderly. We use a stimulant called an adjuvant, so you may need to add that to vaccines. And, of course, we want the best adjuvants with the best vaccines, and that's going to require a level of cooperation that, needs to happen for the good of the world. And yet we've seen, some stories now about how there's a sense that one should do this in a national fashion. That wouldn't be good for those countries, and it wouldn't be good for the world.
Those stories, presumably referring to what was happening in the United States, where reports were coming out that the President, Donald Trump, was attempting to buy a German vaccine company, or there was talk that $1 billion could be offered so that the United States would get exclusive first access to a vaccine. What did you make of those stories?
Well, I mean, again, I don't know what really happened, and I don't know, about that particular story. But what I've heard now in many countries is saying, well, gee, we need these products for ourselves. Maybe we ought to be thinking about, doing this just for us. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. For example, if we manage this epidemic well and we're able to slow down the infections, that's, of course, what we want to do now. It may mean the most efficient place to test new vaccines may be the next place that has the raging epidemic. You may not even be able to test it in the countries, that are producing the vaccine. And that's why it's critical for global science. We saw that with Ebola, where, some great efforts came with new vaccines, and by the time they got there, those vaccines weren't able to be tested because we got the disease under control, but other vaccines were able to be tested, and that's why we have now an Ebola vaccine that is licensed and has been used in the field.
So what happens then when a vaccine is actually developed? Who gets first access? How do you figure that out?
Well, what should happen, of course, is that the places that have the immediate need at that time should have access to the vaccine. That hasn't always been the case. In 2009, when we had the flu pandemic, those vaccines were bought up by a number of countries, and it wasn't made available, across the world. In this case, we're going to start out thinking about access from the beginning. And the challenge will be to make sure there is adequate quantities of vaccine produced. Of course, there's never going to be from day one enough vaccine to cover the world, and that's why it really should be prioritized by where it's needed and not necessarily by the worried well or by, the wealthiest country. That's the goal we'd like to get to.
Well, we were talking about politics. I mean, is there some, pardon my ignorance in this, but is there some sort of body that determines where the vaccine goes? I mean, how do you get to that best case scenario where it ends up where it's most needed?
Well, there isn't a body now, and one of the questions is should the G7, G20 leaders be thinking about this coordination effort. Of course, WHO plays a critical role. They are the organization that sets the normative standards. Our role at GAVI is we provide vaccines for 60% of the world's children, and what we do is negotiate to make sure that there's adequate quantities of vaccines using different financial instruments and work with companies to make sure it's available. The problem we tried to solve was powerful new vaccines were being used in wealthy countries, but weren't made available to developing countries. And frankly, we've now solved that problem, at least with the existing vaccines. We want to do the same to make sure for new epidemic vaccines that that's the case as well.
If you stand back from this just a little bit, knowing what you know about vaccines, how prepared is the world to deal with outbreaks like the one we're seeing right now?
Well, we are better prepared than it's funny because Bill Gates and I did back-to-back TED Talks in Vancouver after the outbreaks occurring in Ebola in West Africa. And we talked about the importance of the world preparing. There are new institutions. There have been more discussions globally, but many countries recently have backed away from that, have stopped funding global health security activities. There's been a lot more interest in nationalism and not thinking about multilateralism and global systems. And that makes me worried because obviously at the end, we are only as strong as the weakest link. So if epidemics are going on anywhere in the world, that threatens the entire world and not just those regions. So we have to have a different mindset about that.
You've said that with increasing population and increasing environmental destruction, we are likely to see an accelerating rate of these types of outbreaks. Tell me more about that.
That's absolutely true. This is an evolutionary certainty from my perspective. This, by the way, is not the first time we've seen a coronavirus jump from animals into human. This is the third time that we know of. But of course, coronaviruses are about a third of the common cold viruses we get seasonally are coronaviruses, and those you can trace back to having jumped, many, many eons ago into humans. So as we have larger populations, as we have more environmental destruction, as we move, into the forest areas, we're going to see more of these outbreaks occur, and that's why we have to prepare for them. The global coronavirus database shows that there are over 30,000 different coronaviruses from many different animals, and many of them have the spike proteins, which is how it attaches to humans, that are similar enough that they probably could jump. But we haven't fully done that research, and that's the type of work we could do to prepare for the future.
How much work is being done on vaccines that will look ahead? There's a metaphor that's being used, and pardon it, here in Canada, it's a hockey metaphor, that you don't want to be where the puck is, you want to be where the puck is going to be. And you can apply that, whether it's soccer, where the ball is going to be or what have you. But it's about creating, in some ways, the conditions so that you're not responding to what's happening right now, but you're prepared for what's about to happen. Can vaccines work in that way?
Absolutely. And that was part of what I tried to argue for 5 years ago and what CEPI is trying to do now. So what you can do is you can, first of all, pick agents that you think might cause outbreaks, and you can actually take that vaccine development as far as you can go. The reason we have an Ebola vaccine today is because Canada, in its national laboratories, made an Ebola vaccine. It wasn't available. It was frozen, but when the outbreak occurred, it was able to be taken out, and it already had been produced, and that made us be able to move quicker. Of course, you may not be able to fully test the vaccine if there's not an epidemic at the time, but then you're that much further ahead. But you also can create what we call platform technologies. And the way to think about that is every year when flu occurs, we take the flu strains from that year and we put them in the backbone that we've been using as a flu vaccine forever. We don't have to start from scratch doing, early stage trials and run through the whole process, because all we have to do is make sure that that vaccine is safe and gives the immune response, and then it can be used. We could have a series of technologies that we know how to manufacture, how to scale up, how to grow for a range of different organisms. And then what you do is when a new agent occurs, you put it into that platform and then move it through clinical testing in an accelerated fashion. That's the type of preparatory efforts we should be having. We've started down that pathway, but of course we're not as far as we could have been if it had that constant attention. If I could just make one more point, and that is, for war, we prepare. We have multiple different lines of preparation. We have first lines of defense, second lines, third lines. For epidemics, we tend to have interest, and everybody says, my God, we have to deal with this. And then as soon as the epidemic's over, people move on and we forget about it. We need to have sustained finance and attention as a global health security issue, and not this kind of ebb and flow of activity and interest. That's what's going to be critical.
Is that what you mean when you say that vaccines in some ways are a victim of their own success?
Well, that's a little bit of a different story. As you know, one of the problems we have now is vaccine hesitancy, ironically, in wealthy countries and often with the most educated populations. The reason is, in my developing countries, you see the diseases everywhere, and of course every parent wants to protect their children from being killed or maimed or having a permanent disability. So they line up to get vaccines, whereas in the West, because we don't see the diseases anymore, people say, oh, well, it can't be that bad, or I'm not going to get it, or, so in a sense, the reason you don't see those diseases is because the vaccines have reduced them to such a level that nobody has experience with them, and therefore the fear and has stopped people from really wanting them.
Is this, just finally, what we're seeing right now, but also that collaboration and the scale of this pandemic, is this a game-changing moment, do you think, when in this conversation?
In some tragic sense, I hate to say the scale is, because I don't want that to be true, but I hope it is going to change our views. I mean, I remember Ebola was not a global threat, although it was seen, the label was ISIS of infectious disease and the news story of the decade, but after that happened, I was trying to raise funds for Ebola vaccines, and people said, oh, that's yesterday's disease. And my worry is we've been through this cycle many times. I hope that this global pandemic, one silver lining, might be that we take this seriously going forward and not just solve this epidemic, but prepare for the ones that will occur in the future.
Seth Berkley, it's great to speak with you about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great talking to you as well.
Seth Berkley is a doctor, epidemiologist, and the CEO of GAVI, the Vaccine Alliance. We reached him in Geneva.